I'm the Vice President of Advancement and the Director of the Foundation. And we are delighted that you could join us this evening, but I'm even more excited about the topic and Mr. Browne being here. So I wanted to give you just a brief bio of some of his many accomplishments and what he's done in the world. He's the retired president of Telemundo Communications Group, and before that, he was executive vice president of NBC, and he's now an independent media consultant. As the executive director of NBC News, he was in charge of all of the national and international news coverage and all of the programming for NBC. And his NBC team led the charge that covered the fall of the Berlin Wall. So, you think back about that time in history and that he was able to witness some of that. He also has been instrumental in the transformation of Telemundo, a Spanish-language television station that's an original content producer and international syndicator, and under his leadership, Telemundo content produced the best ratings in the history of the company. He's also been a long-time advocate and understands the importance and the power of the U.S. Hispanic population, and he led the network wide national launch of Hate Contar, which means be counted. It was an initiative designed to increase awareness for the 2010 census among U.S. Hispanics and increase their participation in this significant national process. He was also instrumental in facilitating a groundbreaking partnership between Telemundo and the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Florida International University, and it was to establish Hispanic Media Futures, which is an innovative student development program to train future Hispanic journalists and communicators. He also has a national reputation as a leader in the recruitment and career development of women and minorities. He's the co-founder and board member of the Women of Tomorrow Mentor and Scholarship Program. And this is a program for at-risk high school girls, and it's been recognized several times on the floor of our U.S. National Congress. He also told me a little story that in 2008, he was inducted into the Journalism Hall of Fame along with Roger Ailes in the same evening, the founder of Fox News. So I imagine that was an interesting counterpoint session that evening. So before we begin, I want to take the time to really thank all of our series sponsors this evening, the Herald Tribune Media Group, WEDU, Courtyard Marriott, the Sarasota World Affairs Council, Cumberland Advisors, Global Interdependence Center, and Metz Catering, who's providing a lovely reception after this. And now, what we've waited for is Mr. Don Browne.
Thank you. That was a great introduction. I'm delighted to be here for a multitude of reasons, but before I begin, sometimes when you go over certain things, you're a storyteller. And I have to be very careful about my storytelling and war stories because, as you know, you can get in trouble by exaggerating war stories. So to keep me in check, I was delighted when I came in to see that two of my wonderful colleagues from my days at NBC are here, Dan Noah and Dan Bradley. We went shoulder to shoulder. So they're going to keep me honest, and if I get a little exaggerated, you'll tell me, right? Another colleague, his parents are here, Eric Wishney's parents are here, a really wonderful colleague that we worked with at NBC. So I'm really delighted to be here. Now, it's been a long journey for me to come to the new College of Florida. And it began in 1981 during the brutal Civil War in El Salvador. I was running NBC's operation there, and at that time it was the biggest story in the world. And during that time, I met this young journalist. He was flying his hands around, but he was passionate, and I could see he had tremendous potential. There was something special about him. His name was Jose Diaz-Balart. And I kind of took him under my wing, and I said, the first thing you got to do, Jose, is you can't be throwing your arms around like that. But we started a really great relationship. And he was special. And I said to him, I said, what is it and why did you become a journalist? Where is your passion, your sense of intellectual curiosity come from? He said, well, I'll tell you exactly where it came from. My experience at the new College of Florida. He said, I was a little different. And when I went there, they embraced my differences. They created a passion and an interest in learning, and they let me be who I was. And they inspired me to become a journalist and tell stories around the world and be a positive force. That's when I first heard about the new College of Floiorda. So needless to say, to be here today with you since 1981, it's a real privilege. So let me tell you what I want to talk about today. I kind of want to talk a little bit about where we've been, kind of where we are, and a little bit about where we're going. I also want to talk about the improbable, unlikely rise of Katie Couric and Matt Lauer, the rise, the fall, and potential comeback of Brian Williams. I also want to talk about, as we go through memory lane, about some of the visionaries, the courageous, risk-taking visionaries that about every 10 years made fundamental advancements in the television news business and the media business. Right now, it's gone to about every 10 months, and now it's about every 10 minutes that there's a change in the media business. But the more things change, the more they remain the same. And this is my view of having observed this for so many years. It goes back to a fundamental DNA that we have that goes back to the Stone Ages. The Stone Ages, they went out hunting during the day, they had a lot of adventures, and they came back around the fire, and one person that had a particular talent of storytelling would bring everybody together, and they would listen to his story about what happened that day. That's in our DNA. And it's very interesting as we go forward with new media and old media, which I'm going to talk about, is it's all the same. And that is, the idea now going forward is taking people who can tell stories and create content and have that content be so compelling that they can bring audiences together. And the difference is, and the name of the game is going to be, who can bring money and revenue to those audiences. That's what I'm going to talk about today. But it was true then, it's true now, and that will always be true. Now let me take you back to the beginning of television. The technology started in 1929, but it really didn't get on the radar screen until the 1939 World's Fair. And that's where television was broadcast essentially for the first time to about 100 television sets in New York City. That's when people started realizing, my God, this is a unique technology, but nobody was able to take it seriously because televisions cost more than a car. So after World War II, they suspended television, and then right after World War II, this is when television news as we know it took off. In covering the war, it was done through radio. How many of you are old enough to remember going to the movies and seeing Fox Movie Tone News? That was how we got it. You know, it was newsreels that were done around the world, and it was about a month or two old, but that was news. The first television newscast that NBC did was essentially running that on television. And then the first television broadcast in history occurred in 1948. Anybody remember Douglas Edwards? 1948, CBS produced a 15-minute newscast with Douglas Edwards. His producer was Don Hewitt. Does anybody know who Don Hewitt is? Boy genius who created that show and then, of course, created the most famous news magazine in history, 60 Minutes. Now, in 1949, how many of you remember the Camel News Caravan? John Swayze? He was the NBC's competition to Douglas Edwards, the Camel News Caravan. Now, John Cameron Swayze went on to be very popular, but as time went on, Douglas Edwards became more popular than John Cameron Swayze, and he went off to do Timex watches. You remember his Timex watch routine? It takes a licking and keeps on ticking. That's the John Cameron Swayze I'm talking about. So basically, as Douglas Edwards became more and more popular, something very significant happened. NBC put together Huntley and Brinkley. How many remember them? In 1957, this is very significant because now in 1957, televisions are becoming more affordable. It's still rare, but more and more people were getting televisions. Huntley and Brinkley changed the game because they started creating a habit of families coming around the television set in the evening and seeing the news. And news and the country started going through a transformation, a significant transformation. Late in the 1950s, the civil rights movement began in the South. And in the 1960s, we went through profound transformational change. I'm going to go to my notes now because I want to take you through the 1960s because it changed our country, it changed television news, and it changed my life. It caused me to want to become a journalist. I'm going to take you through the 1960s. I know that you remember this, but you know, when you put it together in one place, it really tells you how transformational a period we were going through. Of course, not reading off my notes. So let me take you through this. 1960, the first Catholic president was elected, John F. Kennedy. 1960, Martin Luther King begins leading the civil rights movement in the South. 1960s, the Beatles were formed. 1961, we began the Vietnam War. 1962, we almost went to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. 1962, the Rolling Stones were created. 1962, James Browne started crossing over to white audiences. He became the hardest working man in show business. 1963, I was a freshman at the University of South Carolina, went there on a football scholarship. I and many students all over the South walked on campus for the first time with black undergraduate students. First time in history, 1963, all through the South. 1963, JFK was assassinated. 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed. 1965, there were huge and significant riots in Watts in Los Angeles. 1967, five-day war in Israel against Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. 1967, Newark race riots, where scores of people were killed. Detroit, 1967, race riots. 1968, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. 1969, Woodstock happened. Anybody remember Woodstock? I was actually there. A lot of people say they were there. I was actually there. 1969, the gay rights movement started in New York. And what happened to end the decade in 1969? He landed a man on the moon. I mean, think about this. When you talk to young people today and they talk about the transformation we're in, think about what many of us went through in the 1960s. Well, this is when television news really was transformed. In 1962, Walter Cronkite replaced Douglas Edwards because Huntley Brinkley were so ingrained that they needed a competitive edge. So Walter Cronkite, a World War II journalist veteran, took over the reign of the anchor chair. By the way, Anchorman is named after Walter Cronkite because Don Hewitt said he's an anchorman. So he took over in 1962. Now this is a significant game change. Today it doesn't sound like much, but think about this. In 1963, the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite went from 15 minutes to 30 minutes. That sounds like a small thing today. That was huge. And he interviewed, in his first broadcast, he interviewed JFK. And he asked President Kennedy, will you be able to be reelected because of your stance in support of civil rights? Excuse me just a second. My wife told me to turn this off, and I didn't do it. I'm turning it off. Okay. So at this time, and I think many of you in this room remember this, whether you were an NBC fan or a CBS fan, in 1967, Walter Cronkite became the most trusted man in America. And when he said, that's the way it is, we all felt that's the way it was. Now, 1967 was also a transformative time for me because in the late 1950s, when with my parents, we were very, we were poor. And we got a little television set, and for us, sitting around the table, watching this transformative period, watching NBC and CBS cover civil rights and cover these extraordinary events because of the civil rights movement, that's when I decided I wanted to be a journalist. It was profound. I mean, these images that only television news could do. The newspapers are doing a fine job, but these images, night after night, galvanized and energized an entire country. I wanted to be a part of that. So, improbably, because of my background, everybody said, oh, you'll never make it as a journalist, you'll never get in. Well, we were talking to Eric's parents about tenacity and being a pleasant pain in the ass. Well, I was, and I finally got an entry-level job at CBS Network News in New York at 23 years old. And I began my career, and it was quite unbelievable because I was probably the least likely person to succeed because of my background, my pedigree, but I was tenacious, I was determined, and I learned and was mentored by some of the greatest journalists in the world. They took me under their wing, and they gave me a chance. And I got to cover the world: Vietnam, Watergate, civil rights. It was an unbelievable time in network news. And what's interesting is it became this incredible mirror to what was going on in the world. And then we went through a period of status quo. More investments were being made, the news divisions were getting larger, but television news in that time, if you were a journalist, you were never expected to make very much money. It was a calling, it was a passion, it was something you did because you loved to do it. It was almost embarrassing to be paid very much for it. Now, something happened that changed all of our worlds in 1977. There was a genius, another genius, named Roone Arledge. Does anybody remember who he is? He was the head of ABC Sports, and he brought amazing technology to Wild World of Sports. He was amazing. ABC had been a very weak third-place news organization, not even a factor. Well, they made him a dual president of ABC News and ABC Sports. And he revolutionized the network news as we know it. And this is what he did. First of all, he took these high production techniques and he applied it to network news. He made it flashier. He made it more interesting. He also did something that totally changed the game. And what he did is he started picking off the best and brightest journalists at CBS and NBC. Is that my phone or somebody else's phone? Okay. And basically what he would do is double their salaries and basically turn everything into turmoil. It used to be that if you worked for, and Danny, I think you can appreciate this, if you worked for NBC, you stayed at NBC. You were loyal to NBC. If you worked at CBS, you would never leave CBS. Well, Arledge broke that apart and basically started taking the best people in the business to him because he was paying a lot of money. He created the first $1 million anchorman. The whole game was changed. News became pretty much news and entertainment during that time. Well, I was part of that in the sense that CBS was beginning to lose their sense of innovation. They were very much into status quo, satisfied about what they had done, not being progressive about the future. I was frustrated because I was at that time covering Latin America. I was a bureau chief in Atlanta, and I kept advocating to CBS that we open a bureau in Miami, that we begin covering Latin America because it was a significant part of what was going to happen in news. They said, oh, no, we're okay. So NBC came along in 1979 and said, what do you want to do? I said, I want to go and open a bureau in Miami and cover Latin America, and that's when I left CBS, which was very difficult to do, to join NBC. And that's where Danny Noah and I began our adventure together. As you know, that's where I met Jose Diaz-Balart in 1981, covering the Civil War. Well, there was a Civil War in El Salvador, there was a Civil War in Nicaragua, there was a Falklands War in Argentina, Cuban boat lifts, drug wars in Colombia. It was riots in Miami. It was an unbelievable time that Danny and Dan Bradley all went through. We were on nightly news 2 or 3 times a night. It was unbelievable. So at this point, it was pretty much status quo. Let me go back also to 1981. Walter Cronkite retired. And then it was pretty much Dan Rather, Tom Brokaw, and Peter Jennings. And Peter Jennings was beginning to really dominate the news. But it was very competitive. Now let me go back to something I passed over that's very important. Does anybody know who Sigourney Weaver is, the actress? Does anybody know who her father was? Well, exactly. His name is Pat Weaver. Now this is a very important part that I left out that I want to really emphasize. In 1952, as television was emerging, remember we had 2 network newscasts, he saw, as an NBC executive, the enormous transformative power of television. And he saw television as a positive force that could inform, empower, enlighten, inspire, and entertain. And that's what he thought the Today Show would do. That's how he created the Today Show as a vehicle in 1952. It just so happened in 1954, what else did he create? The Tonight Show. So that was his vision. And in those days, and I'm about to go into another transition. Am I making any sense here? Because I know I'm, okay. Yes. I'm about to go through another transition that's very important. Now, in the early days of television, it was a controlled, regulated industry. NBC and CBS initially, and then eventually they were forced to create a third network. They were basically given licenses to make enormous amounts of money. And because of those government licenses, they were required to do some public service. That's how news was born. It was born out of, it won't make any money, but we need to at least do something to justify all that money we're making. So Pat Weaver wanted to do something special in the area of public service, but really to use television as an enlightening force. Very important principle. Now, I'm with Danny. We're running around the world covering all these incredible world events, having a great time jumping on Lear jets. And in 1988, something really amazing happened that changed the entire equation. General Electric bought NBC. Now, why is that important? Because up to this point, theoretically, the news divisions were doing this out of a public service, and some of the news divisions, including NBC, were losing a lot of money in the process. So Jack Welch was running General Electric. Does anybody know what his nickname was? He was named Neutron Jack, because when GE acquired a company, after they acquired it, the only thing that was left standing was the buildings and no people. He was a pretty successful but feared man. So essentially, when he found out that in 1988 that NBC News lost $200 million, he said, that's unacceptable. And he had a meeting in Bonaventure, Florida, and all the top NBC executives were there, and he came and made a speech. And he said, you know, when I walk in a room like this, he said, it's amazing. When I acquire a company, I can walk in a room, and he said, I can feel the passion, I can feel the energy, I can feel the willingness to compete. And all the senior executives were going, and he said, you know, I don't feel it in this room. And he said, I don't think you guys are going to make it. And you know what? 2 years later, none of them were, the only person that made it in that room, somehow I survived, but they all were gone. But I wasn't an executive. I was invited because it was in Florida. So what Jack Welch said to the NBC News executives was, if you don't change, I'm going to give it a year and a half. If you don't straighten this out, I'm going to just blow up NBC News and do a deal with CNN, and it's going to be over. You've got a year and a half to fix it. So, as Danny will tell you, I was a pretty maverick, wild and crazy bureau chief. True. I was also considered to be a change agent. And part of the change that I wanted, and this is very important, you made reference to it earlier, I have a passion for the underdog. And in the television news business, there was very little diversity. There were very few women, very few minorities. And I made a promise to myself, if I made it at CBS in the early days, I would dedicate myself to mentoring people, particularly women and minorities, in the industry. So I had, and Danny knows this, I had what I call my 50 kids. I was tracking all these young journalists, striving, like Eric, striving to be in the business. I knew where they were. I helped them. So in 1989, I was recruited to New York to be a change agent, to be part of either solving what NBC News needed to solve or be part of it failing. So I said no 2 or 3 times and finally said yes if they would commit to real change and if they would commit to bringing diversity to NBC News. So when I showed up, I was charged with trying to eliminate the redundancy and the waste and the politics and the silos that had created over the years, and I started doing that. But the other thing that I was not expected to do that happened unexpectedly is the two major executives, I won't tell you their names, but one was the president of NBC Sports, very famous man, and my boss drove the Today Show into a wall because Today Show was very successful with Brian Gumbel and Jane Pauley, but the demographics report was that it was beginning to viewers were getting a little older. So they decided that let's bring a young, vibrant personality to the Today Show, and they hired Deborah Norville, who I had mentored early in her career and advocated at NBC. They decided to put Deborah Norville on the news desk. Well, Jane Pauley wasn't very happy about that because Jane Pauley figured, I know what they're doing. They're setting me up. So the Today Show started getting very dysfunctional. The ratings started to go down. And they, in fact, replaced Jane Pauley with Deborah Norville. And the Today Show, a $200 million profit center, started going down the tubes. So they took these two executives on the side, and they said, you've got to fix it. That would be me. Okay, so what I couldn't do is I couldn't go out and hire Diane Sawyer for $2 million because we didn't have the budget. So what I did was I incorporated some of my kids. Let me tell you about Katie Couric. Katie Couric was a terrific, young, tenacious, wonderful journalist. But she didn't have blow-dried hair. She wasn't perfectly coiffed. She was a personality, and she was tenacious, and she was talented. And all the local news stations she worked in, she would go to the news director, and she would say, can I anchor? And they said, well, Katie, you're a great journalist, but you're no anchor. You're just not anchor material. So I knew Katie because I had been mentoring her for several years. So she was hired to be the #2 at the Pentagon. So as I was charged to do this, I put her together with a young man, named 25 years old, named Jeff Zucker. And I put them together for about 6 months. She was a national correspondent for the Today Show, not an anchor, and he was her producer. They'd collect. Jeff was a boy wonder. So here's what I did. I needed to counter Brian Gumbel's kind of edge and attitude with somebody who was strong enough to stick up with him, but not in a negative way, but somebody that could hold her ground. I knew Katie could do that. So I put Katie Couric in the slot next to Brian. I put this 26-year-old Jeff Zucker in charge as the executive producer, and I put Ann Curry on the news desk. People thought I was out of my mind. I was a little bit. I figured, why not take the ultimate risk? Well, as it turns out, they clicked. As it turns out, the ratings started turning around. As it turns out, they had great chemistry. Then Brian Gumbel said he had had enough. And he decided that he was going to leave. So now what are we going to do? Well, before Brian left, there was another unlikely person who emerged, Matt Lauer. So you would think, oh, Matt Lauer must have been a big guy before he went in the Today Show. Well, Matt Lauer burned out in the business, and he went to work for a tree trimming company. It's true. So my dear friend, Ken Lindner, who's a big-time agent, convinced him to come back into the business. So he was brought back to WNBC New York to be the weekend morning host. Minor job. Then eventually he became a Monday through Friday anchor for WNBC in New York. Pretty good, but he didn't have the network chops. So the agent kept saying, look, would you at least let him substitute for Brian Gumbel one day? And I said, sure, why not? So one day I went to Jeff Zucker. I said, look, I'd like you to, Brian's going to go on vacation. Give him a day. And he said, no, he's not good enough. He doesn't have the chops. I said, look, one of the things I get to do as a boss, Jeff, is every once in a while I tell you what to do. So just do it. So it was really interesting, and I think Dan and Danny Noah can appreciate this. So I'm under a lot of pressure now because they're not very happy that I'm giving Matt Lauer this opportunity. So basically, I'm sitting by the control room, and they're counting down to 7 a.m. 3, 2, 1. The light goes on. Katie opens. Matt talks, and all of a sudden, there's a chemistry there that's unbelievable. 5 minutes into the Today Show, we knew who the replacement to Brian Gumbel was going to be. And Katie and Matt and Ann went on to be one of the most successful morning news teams in the history of television. Now, while that was going on, remember Jane Pauley? Jane was beloved. I'm sure a lot of you remember Jane Pauley. Okay. And she was a very special person, but Jane was a person scorned, and she was very upset, and there was a lot of negativity against NBC because of the way she had been treated. So my job now is to save Jane Pauley, and remember, we're trying to become positive and not negative and losing money. The reason ABC and CBS were successful is ABC had 20/20, the news magazine, and CBS had 60 Minutes. They produced enormous amounts of revenue. NBC had 10 failed news magazines, so I was now assigned to create a news magazine. So remember Roone Arledge? What did he do? He went and picked off the best number twos at the other networks, right? So what I did is I hired the number two at 60 Minutes, and I hired the number two at ABC. I got Stone Phillips to come over from ABC. Jane Pauley didn't want to do it. I don't know if you remember Stone Phillips. He was this gorgeous, talented young man. As soon as he walked in with Jane said, I'll do it. So as it turns out, Dateline has become an enormously successful NBC News franchise and has contributed greatly to the fact that we were able to not only break even, but become a profitable part of the GE NBC organization. And the last thing before I left to go back to Miami is I had to really put a succession plan in place for Tom Brokaw. Tom was beginning, frankly, to lose a little bit of a step, and it was clear that Tom never was supportive of young anchors coming up to replace them. Somehow Tom managed to make sure they weren't able to do that. So basically, I had seen this really talented young man named Brian Williams, who was an anchorman for WCBS in New York. I thought he was amazing. And one day, I asked my head of talent if she would set up a dinner. And she said, look, why waste your time? He's the heir apparent to Dan Rather. He's being groomed to replace Dan Rather. And I said, well, just do it. So we went out and had dinner. It was amazing. It was a 3.5-hour dinner. We sort of fell in love with each other because all that Brian Williams wanted to do in his life was to be Walter Cronkite. That was his greatest aspiration. That was his hero. Obviously, I worked with and for Walter Cronkite for years. I was very close to him, and I was able to really connect and bond with him. Even though I was at NBC, we had this amazing CBS connection. So one thing led to another. I got Tom Brokaw involved, and we were incredibly, unbelievably able to recruit Brian Williams to NBC. And by the way, CBS was devastated. So in 1994, Brian Williams basically took over Nightly News. Nightly News went from third to second to first place. He had a long run, as you know, in first place. Now, what happened to Brian Williams? Brian is a blue-collar kid that grew up in central New Jersey. He never graduated from college. He was incredibly smart, incredibly well-informed, incredibly passionate. And integrity and credibility was essential because his hero was all about that. By the way, Walter Cronkite didn't graduate from college either. So what happens is when you come from a place that Brian came from, nobody is prepared for the celebrity that comes with being in a position, one of the most powerful people in the country, one of the most powerful people in the world, anchoring a network newscast. So very few people are able to keep their feet on the ground and stay grounded. So what happened is, Brian, not only is he a first-class journalist, he is one of the funniest people you'll ever meet. He's incredibly talented. So as his celebrity grew, he began appearing with great support, by the way, for NBC on the David Letterman show, on the Tonight Show. So when he appeared on the show, he began to lose his bearings a little bit. He began to confuse what he was as a news anchor and the integrity and credibility that required with being entertaining on the Letterman show and on the Tonight Show. So as he began to lose his bearings, and I'm going to be very candid right now, his colleagues and the NBC executives at NBC knew that he was losing his bearings because they knew what he did in real life, whether it be overseas assignments or assignments during Katrina. They knew what he did and didn't do, where he was and where he wasn't, but they kind of enjoyed his celebrity. They enjoyed the fact that when he went on these programs, the ratings would stay high. So in a sense, and I'm being provocative, this is my view, there was an enabling process that went on. Nobody put their foot down and said, Brian, stop it. So he paid the ultimate price. He destroyed or hurt his own credibility and integrity and the integrity of NBC News, which is essential to a news organization. So now, it's interesting as Brian is trying to resurrect his career, when he debuted, getting his second chance, it just so happened when the Pope was visiting. Is it resurrection? I don't know, maybe, but in any case. At least he has a chance to make a comeback. I think people in our society like to build people up. When they fall, sometimes they're given second chances. Time will tell. Now, let me go back to this progression, and I'm going to get into some of the new media, and then hopefully we can have some conversation and mix it up a little bit, and we can have a little fun answering some of your questions, and I'll go deep and up close and personal and be very candid about any questions you have. So let me talk about a couple of other milestones that are very important. So in this new world that we're in, GE began. It was about, you've got to earn profits. We don't care about public service. We care about it, but you've got to be self-sustaining and make money. GE took over NBC, Disney took over ABC, and Viacom took over CBS. These are all bottom-line, big-time companies where they demand the fact that a news division makes money. And that is a very important game changer in the history of the news organizations, because news organizations, again, it was supposed to be a public service. It was supposed to be a calling. It wasn't supposed to be a bottom line and profits. But that's the name of the game. That's the reality that we deal with. Now, what happens is, and I've left my notes there, so just bear with me. I left out another incredible milestone. And I can't believe I left this person out because they're a little crazy like me. So what happens in 1980? A almost certifiable guy comes along who has an amazing new vision of using technology like no one else has ever done. And cynics and the networks who are fat and happy and not changing, not adapting, not evolving, called this organization Chicken Noodle News, a CNN. Ted Turner in 1980 had the vision of using satellite technology and creating a 24-hour cable news network. Remember, we're talking about 30 minutes of news. People thought he was crazy, and Danny and Dan will tell you, he recruited these young disciples, probably very much like Eric, people who were passionate, people who believed in this visionary, because they had to be disciples, because they were going by the seat of their pants. They had no idea what they were doing, but they believed in what they were doing. And by God, they created a juggernaut. They left CBS, ABC, and NBC in the dust and created a 24-hour news cable network that was unbelievable, because he had the vision, and he was gutsy enough and crazy enough to invest in it. And it changed all of our worlds. And you remember in the field, Danny, when CNN would show up, it was, nobody took them serious, right?
We used to give them the last 5 minutes of our birth.
Exactly. I mean, it's so in any case, so there's another visionary who could see things and had the courage to act on it and to recruit talent around that. Now, couple of other significant things happened, and that is in 1996, MSNBC was born. It was okay. It was Microsoft and NBC had a partnership. They wanted to embrace a little technology. It wasn't very successful, but at least it was an effort. And the same year, back to Roger Ailes, Rupert Murdoch decided that he was going to launch a cable news network, Fox. They were ridiculed. They were mocked. They said, you don't have the resources. You won't be able to do it. He hired Roger Ailes, who was a maverick, who was a visionary, and they said, not going to happen. You don't have the resources. You don't have the vision. And of course, for 15 years, Fox News has been #1 cable news network of all of them. They also shook it up, and because somebody had a vision, they recruited great talent who had passion and believed in the vision, and they've also become a juggernaut. So here you have essentially basically what we call the traditional old media now, and in terms of you have the cable networks and you have the broadcast networks. Now, something else that I did mention earlier, because I'm not going off of notes, is what I had intended to talk about is the transformative period that we're going through now. I talked about the 60s, but we're going through an amazing transformative period. The demographics of our country are changing dramatically. The majority population is getting smaller. Minority population is getting significantly larger. The way people consume information, it splits about 30 plus and under 30. Under 30, they don't watch television anymore. 30 plus are still watching traditional media and consuming new media and digital media. Now, when I talk about the transformation of demographics, we're also, as you know, going through this technological revolution. It is stunning how fast technology is changing all of our lives, including media. The other thing is the world's shrinking. The world's getting incredibly competitive. All these things are going on at the same time. It's a profound time of change. So media has been essential in terms of, and particularly television news and news in general in a free society, and showing us kind of where we are and informing us about what's going on. Now, I talked about the 60s and how, and a lot of you lived through every night watching these extraordinary things on television and the transformative aspect that news had during that time. Right now, a lot of people are writing off traditional media, but think about this. When Katrina happened in New Orleans, all government functions broke down. It was total chaos. The only institution that was standing was television news. It was the eyes and the ears of the world. When 9/11 happened, most institutions were breaking down in chaos. The way people were making decisions was because television news was able to be the eyes and the ears of a national catastrophe. That's where the president was getting his information. That's where everybody was getting their information. When the Berlin Wall happened, NBC was the only network broadcasting live, but only a traditional broadcaster or television entity could bring you those events. And this is very important because we're in very uncertain times. And there are going to be more of these kinds of things. And the traditional media, whether it's the news cable networks or the traditional networks, it's very important that they continue to have the resources to be there during times of crisis, during pivotal times in our society. And it's going to happen because the world is shrinking, the world is getting more dangerous. Now, new media is creating enormous amounts of value. Now, just going through the timeline, let me take you through a couple more timelines, and I'm going to open it up for conversation, and I'm going to make an observation. Let me go back to the progression of the timelines that I was talking about. This is interesting. In 2002, remember I was talking about these demographic changes? I had for 20 years, and I think Danny can affirm this, I had been a pain in the neck to NBC about getting into the Spanish language news business. It was kind of a company joke. Well, eventually, I kept at them, and in 2002, I convinced Jeff Immelt, who was the new chairman of General Electric, and Bob Wright, who was the CEO of NBC, to spend $2.7 billion to buy the Telemundo Communication Company, the largest investment in the history of NBC, long history. And the reason that Immelt and Wright invested in it, because they could see the demographic growth of Hispanics in this country. They could see the billions and billions of dollars of buying power. They could see the importance of investing in a diverse audience for the future. Now, I was thrilled that we invested in Telemundo, but in 2003, I was a little put off by the fact that they called me and said, okay, we bought it, you've got to run it. So ironically, in 2003, I was reunited with Jose Diaz-Balart, who was the main anchor for the Telemundo News. We were back together again. And we created an amazing opportunity for Hispanics in this country in producing original content. Univision and Telemundo are major players in this. Hispanic growth is dramatic, and it's an important part of the equation of news and media. A couple more things. 1997, a couple of students at Stanford got an idea and went off to a garage and created Google. Google was a huge sea change in the way digital media, new media were going to evolve. Then in 2004, my son, who was going to Harvard, called me and he said, hey, Dad, one of my classmates has this thing called Facebook. I'm gonna join it. What do you think? I said, oh, it sounds pretty good to me. Mark Zuckerberg has, at 19 years old, I mean, basically this is when it started, has created a game changer and a scale that nobody could have imagined. This is in 2004. 2005, Twitter came along. And in I got it reversed. 2005, YouTube came along in 2005, and Twitter came along in 2006. Now, let me bring it home here. I said earlier when I was talking about this, two headlines right now. One about Dan Rather. Have you heard about the movie The Truth? Well, the movie isn't true. The fact is that Dan Rather embarrassed CBS. He embarrassed himself. He embarrassed the credibility and integrity of CBS News by jumping ahead of something, taking fraudulent information and putting it out as fact. But now Hollywood is reinventing the narrative that somehow Dan Rather was a hero. Well, that's not true. But the fact is, credibility and integrity in the news business will always be an essential ingredient for success. The other thing that is in the news, day before yesterday, the head of Twitter laid off 300 people. And let me go back to the principles here about the future and the basics. The more things change, the more they remain the same. The fact is, companies like Twitter, and every 5 minutes you hear about another content company that's being created, creating enormous amount of value. But what's interesting about Twitter is that they have great content that produces large audiences. But what it's not producing is profits to sustain it. They have great valuations. They're worth billions of dollars, but they can't quite find a way to generate revenues. That's why they cut the 300 jobs, because they have to find a way to do four things. One, to create compelling content that has the ability to inform, the ability to empower, the ability to inspire, the ability to entertain, the ability to enlighten. They've got to create that kind of content that's so compelling that they can attract a significant audience, and that audience will then reward them with revenue. Now, that's where the rubber's going to hit the road. You hear everyone's talking about, you know, under 30, they're all getting their information from all these different places. But at some point, these valuations go up, but at some point, the rubber is going to hit the road. They're going to have to generate some kind of revenue to sustain it. And this is what's going to be interesting. There's going to be a shakeout. And go back to the traditional media. They're not going away. They have the scale to invest in this new media. And the New York Times desperately right now is trying to save themselves by moving into digital media. They just hit 1 million subscribers. They're doubling down. CNN right now, most of their investments going into digital and new media. It's not in traditional media. So you've got the traditional media that have scale, that have the ability to invest, that are buying into digital and new media. But all of these people, at some point, you're going to see a shakeout where the strong will survive if they have those basic ingredients. One, integrity and credibility, the ability to produce compelling content, and the ability to produce enough revenue to sustain it. And that's going to be the name of the game going forward. But at the end of the day, I'll say it again, the 60s were an incredibly transformative period where television news came of age. We are now approaching uncharted territory in terms of the threats and potential significant news stories that are going to occur. And we are going to need the news media more than ever in the next year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. A free society needs a vigorous, strong journalistic enterprise. We have no idea what form it's going to take. And it's going to be very interesting as the demographics, young people, the way they consume news, we have no idea when they turn 30, 40, or 50 how they're going to be consumed. Everybody assumes it's going to be the same. Frankly, if anybody tells you they know, they don't. And that's why, coming back to New College, the philosophy of New College is to be out-of-the-box thinkers, to be creative, to be able to visualize and see things that are new, not being encumbered by traditional measurements, but basically turning people loose to be who they are, to be creative, and to change the world. Just like that young man I met in 1981 in El Salvador, Jose Diaz-Balart, who, by the way, is the only, not only is he one of the most respected journalists in the world, he's the only journalist that is broadcasting in Spanish at 6:30 for the nightly newscast on Telemundo, and has a program on MSNBC 5 days a week in English. Not a bad journey for Jose Diaz-Balart, and a wonderful journey for me to be here with you tonight. So with that, let's mix it up. And I have a million things I'd like to talk about. I have, with all the years, almost 50 years that I've been in the business, I'd be more than happy to mix it up, have some conversation, be provocative. I'll answer anything you can throw at me. Did I exaggerate anything? Okay, I want to make sure my credibility is up.
I'll start off with a question for you. You mentioned cable news, the 24-hour news cycle where you can take an event and cover it. The 24-hour news cycle where you can take an event, whether it's a mass shooting or whatever, and cover it for 8, 10, 12 hours. Has that been good for our business, or has that been bad for our business? Has that helped our credibility, or has that stretched our credibility? What is your sense of what the 24-hour news cycle has done for news?
I think it's a great question. Is more better, or is less is more? And the fact is, what we're missing, I think we're desperately missing context and perspective. You know, it's very, for instance, to your point, right now, and again, I'm going to be a little provocative, but you asked me a question. With this new reality, and in fact, I have a full-page New York Times ad, which costs $100,000, by the way, where they're basically asking people if you see a police shooting in a video, send it in. Now, if all you see are police beating people up and shooting people, if that's all you see, pretty soon you think that's all there is. But the fact is, there's no context to that story. This story, right on CNN right now, every video that they can find, they're showing basically police officers doing bad things. Well, as it turns out, to put the context in perspective, it's a very, very small percentage of police officers that are doing that. However, the quantity and the relentlessness of this image the perception begins that all police are bad. And there's no context. in other areas about people, and this is what, I'm not suggesting that we go back to another time, but in the older days of television news, there was an editorial process where you had some form of balance and perspective in the stories that you produced. Now, it's just video without any kind of rhyme or reason or perspective or context about what's really going on. I think it is a little dangerous. And right now, the fact is that everybody used to be, the reason that journalism, broadcast journalism, or journalism itself in television was, it was controlled. So basically you had people who were professionals who were trained at doing this. Now you have citizen journalists. Anybody with an iPhone can do text and pictures. They're citizen journalists. So you have enormous amounts of this information, and what these new media companies are doing is they're aggregating this content, and whoever the best storytellers are, they put it together, they create an audience, but it's not always in the best interest of us, because this idea of having a collective experience, I think, is very important. And we just saw the Republican debates and the Democratic debates. You had 24 million people watching the Republican debate. You had 15 million people watching the Democratic. This is important, that we are able to come to a place, a collective place, where we can see something going on, where there is some reasonable sense of a collective experience with some reasonable sense of context and perspective. And I think we're desperately losing the context and the integrity of the material. The whole thing about Dan Rather was he and his team got fraudulent information, and they knew it. Yet they put it on the air because he was so desperate to get this news out about George Bush that he didn't do the checks and balances that he should have done. So a lot of this material that's coming into this new media, it's not vetted. It's just raw information without legitimacy or context. And I think it will shake itself out, because the counterbalance to that is, with the internet, if you say something that, this is the benefit, if you say something that's not correct, you'll have 15 fact checkers say that's wrong. And in fact, that's what happened with Dan Rather. That was one of the first examples of the internet challenging the authenticity of his information. That was one of the first examples of it being out there and the internet calling him on it. That's how it happened. So I don't know if I answered your question. Exactly. They said that's, they started comparing notes, and yes.
Given the focus on bottom line financially, have you had some examples in the past where top management was telling you on the news side, whoa, can't go there, they're one of our biggest advertisers?
I'll have to, I'm going to be, I told you I was going to be candid. The answer is no. And I think most people that I've worked with in my career would stand up and put their career on the line to say no. Now, having said that, there are subtle suggestions that filter in that could influence you subconsciously. But I think if anybody directly said that, there'd be a rebellion in the newsroom. Certainly in the traditional media that I've been involved with, that just cannot happen. Now, it was interesting about there's a very, Dan, and you can speak to this, having been in local television, there's a firewall between the salespeople and corporate and the newsroom, correct?
Yeah, the worst thing in the world can happen on a local level, a smaller base, is that your journalist is out working a story, a very good story. As the news manager, you know about it. A car dealer. Okay, well, what's the #1 commercial you see when you're watching your local newscast, but car dealers, okay? So the worst thing in the world you want to do is go after a car dealer, but if he's doing something wrong, you're going to go after him. Well, the last thing in the world you want to know, you don't want the general manager to know about it. Well, who's the first person who gets the call from the car dealer? Is the general manager. So if you get pressure But it's like he says, at some point you just have to stand up and say, you know what, we're doing the story. If it's wrong, they can sue us, and you can fire them.
Yeah, but that's...
I never got fired.
Well, and probably he should have been a couple of times because he... But I'll tell you a real quick story which is interesting. When I was a general manager of an NBC station in Miami, and we did an expose on a furniture dealer, and not even on the furniture, it was one of their relatives. And they went crazy and canceled the account, significant account. So the group were Cuban exiles that came here from Cuba and reestablished their business. So I went over and had a meeting with them, and it was a very contentious meeting. They were very angry at me because we basically, in their minds, put their name in a negative sense. And I said to them, I said, you know, you came to this country, you've enjoyed being here, but there's a free press here which wasn't in the Cuba that you left. Whether you like it or not, a free press is essential to our community, it's essential to our country, and that's an important principle. And you've got to understand, that's what happened here. And they walked back and they said, you know what? We're good. So you can't just roll over. I mean, you've got to confront these things. The other thing I'll tell you about in terms of the firewall, when I went up to New York, I'm telling you, this firewall was intense. They wouldn't even let salespeople walk in the hallways of NBC News. But remember, we were trying to go from losing $200 million to at least break even and in the black. So once a week, I would invite the salespeople down to my office, which was unprecedented, just to brainstorm, not to influence the news. And we came up with, you may remember this, a $1 million idea. And let me ask you if you think this compromises news. One of my favorite things on Today's Show was Willard Scott doing 100 birthdays, right? So all we did was put Hallmark around it, and we produced $1 million. I don't think we compromised news principles. I mean, basically, but it actually made it more attractive, and it enabled us to use that $1 million to invest in news resources that cover the news. So sometimes you have to have the firewall, but you also have to have common sense. I don't think that violated integrity or credibility. I think it actually enhanced what his segment was. So. But it is a very serious conversation that's always had newsrooms, and fights do go on, but anybody worth their salt in this business, as Stan has done, as I have done, will stand and keep that conversation away from the integrity of news. Yes?
So I'm a 33-year-old economist, so my only connection to the 60s is 1964. That's when my home was built.
Wow.
So that's my connection to the 60s. But I want you to comment for me. I don't rely on any one particular news outlet. I'm interested in multiple points of view. So in terms of how I gather my news, it's print, it's online, it's television. So I have at least 10 different sources that I use to gather those multiple points of views, and I think it can be dangerous for someone to be 100% loyal to any one particular outlet or news program. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
You are the poster child of the way it should be, and no, seriously, But there is a danger in this, and I'll tell you. Well, for instance, one of my favorite thoughts is, you remember Goldilocks when she went into the bear's place? They had porridge, and she tried one that was too hot, and one that was too cold, and one that was just right. Well, you have Fox over here, you have CNN allegedly in the middle, and you have MSNBC way over to the left. Okay, so one might be too hot. One might be too cold, one might be just right, but you should try each one to get a good sense. And that's a kind of a silly response to your question, but what's happening though is, and this is a danger, in that people are gravitating toward what they want to hear. Now, part of the MSNBC, and this is absolutely the truth, why are they way over on the left. That's not my assessment, that's everybody's assessment. It's business. They basically, Fox staked out the right. CNN allegedly has staked out the middle. The only place for them to go was to the left. So it's a business proposition. They're doing what they're doing. Their commentary is what it is to make money, because that was available to them. Roger Ailes, again, we can agree to disagree, but Roger Ailes saw an opening that the mainstream media was liberal, and it is. It is liberal. He said, okay, I have an opportunity to stake out a place. So if you're just watching one news outlet, or you're in social media and going to one place where everybody agrees with your point of view, that's incredibly dangerous, because it was comforting and reinforcing, but just going back to New College, does it open your mind? Does it provoke you to think a little differently? And this is really critical thinking right now. Is so important in our future, because things are moving fast. People have to get involved, and people have to be informed. Otherwise, I think critical component of a free society is a vigorous journalistic opportunity. If you're not taking advantage of that, I don't think you're being a good citizen, and I think it's going to hurt us in the long run. But I think this idea, and you make a very good point, of this reinforcing something you already believe as opposed to opening up your mind to other ideas is a dangerous proposition. Yes?
You were talking about older people are people who are now basically watching television, 30 and older.
Right.
When do you think looking in the future, when will older women be hired as anchor or Today or Tonight?
I mean
50 plus.
That's a great question. But it's really funny about what you say that. I have fought very, very hard and by the way, it wasn't easy. I mean, basically, the executives I dealt with were not embracing my ideas of hiring women and minorities. But it's interesting when you think about the generation of women that have really defined a lot of television. Katie Couric is well into her 50s. Diane Sawyer is getting close to 70. Barbara Walters was well into her 70s and 80s. I mean, there are significant women that have really changed the game of television news and media. I think that ship has sailed. I don't think, now in local news, I think some of the most, and Dan, you can, I think one of the most iconic anchors, I don't know if she's still there, was at your station forever. Yeah, and how old do you think she is? I mean,
well, she just retired. The flip side of that is, I was in Sainer for 22 years with Gail Searns, and I left there in 2001, and the last thing I did before I left was sign her to a 12-year contract, which was unprecedented. You just didn't do contracts that long.
Right.
But we didn't want her to go anywhere, and we had to beg her. I retired in December coming from Columbus, Ohio, the UPC affiliate there, but a similar older woman anchor, Colleen Marshall, and she wanted to leave last year. Her contract was up. She's an attorney. She's 58, and she just, she's done with it. And we're begging, please don't go. Your voice is so important. And we ended up offering her an incredible 8-year contract because she wanted to stay all the way through the next election after this, because she goes politics. But you're done when you're begging these women to not leave, and it's not a matter of money. I mean, we're zeros on the checks. But you get to a point, and it's a nasty, hard business.
But it was, for years, it was the exception. Women were doing jobs that were really news directors, but they were called assistants. I mean, basically, it was only until the last 10 or 15 years that women have really broken through in the business. But now, here's a game changer, and I think, Dan, you can speak to this. Women, I'll tell you, are running circles around men in this business. There are, the reason this is changing is there are so many women news directors now who are running these news operations, and now increasingly general managers who are making these decisions. So I would say the playing field is significantly more even today than it's ever been. And I would tell you, coming out of these journalism schools, women are, this is my observation, I've hired hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, are running circles around the men who are coming out of these schools. They see, it's almost an immigrant mentality. They see the opportunity, they're hungrier, they're more aggressive, they're more passionate about what they're doing, and they're kind of winning the day. I don't know if you saw that, you know, but it's true, and I think it's very encouraging because this goes back to good business. And this is what I would always, whenever I hear a company say, well, we have to commit ourselves to diversity, I would say, don't do it unless you think it's good business. If you have Hispanics, African Americans, Asians, whoever it is, a growing population, you've got to be, or women, you've got to reflect that in the people that are reflecting who you are and who's presenting the information that you're presenting. People want to see a reflection of themselves and society into what you're doing. It's just good business. And I think people have finally awakened to the fact that don't do it for the sake of doing it. It's good business. And I think that's why we're seeing what Dan talks about. I think it's the trend that I'm seeing. And I hope wherever you're watching television, you're seeing it too. But there's still this idea that, you know, this goes back to the Katie Couric idea. Katie, this is very important. Why did Katie succeed when a $500,000 a year anchor in Chicago, who is attractive and smooth and polished, didn't succeed? Katie was authentic. She wasn't, and this is what happens sometimes on local television. They'll take a young, idealistic reporter, they'll start doing the hair, it's all about cosmetics as opposed to being authentic. Katie Couric was never created in an artificial way. She was authentic. So when she finally got to the anchor chair, she wasn't manufactured by some consultant who said you should turn like this, you should look like this. She connected with the audience because she was a little rough around the edges, but she was real. She was authentic, and she drew from all these real journalistic experiences that she had. She had credibility, and she was the kind of person that you'd want to sit down with over a cup of coffee to talk about the day's events. So being authentic is really critical in terms of being successful. Yes?
Are they paid the same for the same job?
Pardon?
Are the women paid the same for the same job?
No, because they're, you'll hear this a lot. They probably don't present themselves or negotiate as aggressively or present their talents as aggressively as they should. That's changing. That's a generational change. It's the last 5 years, women have become very aggressive and are demanding equality. But for the most part, for the last 45 to 50 years that I've been around, there's been a very bad disconnect between what men are paid and what women are paid. That gap is closing dramatically. Yeah, Dan.
Back to Browne Williams for a second. Danny and I were lucky enough to know each other and retire here. I'm lucky enough to have him buy a boat, so I can...
It's always good to have a friend with a boat, right?
Yes, the best boat in the world, somebody else's. Anyhow, we talk a lot because we spend so much time together in the news business. And when the Browne Williams story broke, it was a huge topic of conversation on the boat between the two of us. And one of the things that I felt was that the central core of why something like that could happen is that Browne, like a lot of network anchors and even a lot of powerful local anchors, carry an additional title. In addition to being the anchor man, they're a managing editor, or in some cases a local news director. And it would seem to me that the idea that the guy or the gal that's going to sit there and put their face out there should not be the person who has the ultimate authority of what's going to be said or what's going to be done. And what role do you see that kind of playing in how that unfolded?
Well, that started with Walter Cronkite, because I think he became the first news. By the way, the anchor, Walter Cronkite, is Don Hewitt coined the phrase news anchor as Walter Cronkite. He said he was the anchor of the broadcast. So I think he was the first one that got managing editor, because he was a 500-pound gorilla. He could get whatever he wanted, and he wanted to have that title. So that title was sort of, as you became successful, it's a title that was ordained on you. I think it's a mistake, because I think what happens is when you become that powerful, and I saw it with Cronkite. I mean, basically, who's going to argue with him? When he says, you know, when he was in his heyday, if he said it's going to be such and such, you need voices that argue. You need a vigorous editorial debate where you have the confidence that you can say to Cronkite, you're wrong, that's not the right editorial position on this, and keep your job. And that happened with Brian Williams. Brian Williams got so powerful that he had a disproportionate influence in terms of what was going to be on that broadcast. So if you're a line producer and you say, I disagree, they might not fire you, but you know, you get the look. And then you're going to, and that is a chilling effect. It's a great point. And I think that is something that should be addressed. And I think that contributed to why people didn't put their foot down and say, Brian, stop that. Because he became almost too powerful. And you know, some people are afraid to speak up because they're afraid that, you know, it may affect their careers. So that's a great point. Yes?
I went back through my life as I heard you speaking, because I remember television beginning, and I remember Cronkite. And one of the things that you talked about is how we all sat down and listened to one anchorman or one person we chose, and we believed he told the truth.
True.
Now I don't have anyone like that, or maybe you can tell me someone I can. But I have to do what she does. I love Jose on MSNBC, and I guess the only one I avoid is Fox, but I listen to all of them. Because I know Fox doesn't tell the truth. I've been told that. So,
right. Well,
so where's the truth?
Well, I tell you, if I were to, and pardon me for going here, because we're having a candid conversation, have a little fun, right?
Yeah.
I have an opinion or two. I think the closest thing, politics aside, editorial vantage point, the closest thing, and I'd like to get some opinions. So there are two people that I think are truly emerging right now. Bill O'Reilly, politics aside, he is the closest thing to a throwback of a voice of reason, a voice of perspective. Whether you agree or disagree with him, he has that kind of maturity, father figure. And again, he's not for everybody, but he probably is the closest thing to what we remember as an authoritative individual, right? Whether you agree with his editorials or not. The other person that I think is spectacular is Megyn Kelly. I mean, again, Megyn Kelly she's right down the middle. She's confident. She's accomplished. She's credible. And I think she is going to emerge as the superstar in television and in news in the next 5 years. Yes?
You know, just back to your point of keeping a balance. I like the balance of Megyn Kelly and Rachel Maddow. And I flip back.
Well, that's quite an interesting
That's right.
balance.
And I flip back and forth to see on the same subject that you think they're talking about entirely different events. By the twist that it gets.
Right.
And some conservative friends of mine say, "Why do you watch that, Rachel?" I said, "I want to maintain a perspective on these subjects."
Well, again,
but I agree with you on Megyn Kelly. She is fantastic. She really is.
And she's 44 years old. And by the way, she was a very successful lawyer who had an epiphany that one day she decided she wanted to be a journalist, and she became, I'm going to use a little bad word, what I call a pleasant pain in the ass, to Roger Ailes. She kept on him and on him and on him. He finally said, okay, I'm going to give you a shot. And she's really emerging, I think, as a great role model for whatever gender you are. But I think Megyn Kelly's standing out in the crowd right now.
And the New York Times Magazine had her on the cover.
Yeah, how about that? Are we, yes, please.
Question that you may not be able to answer. Does the name Byron Killane mean anything to you?
No.
He was for many years with the Wall Street Journal, and his main job was to be a fact checker. I mean, he was on the letterhead. I mean, a very
Right. That's a very important job.
But he vetted every story with the idea that the lawyers would be protected against any claim that would come against the Wall Street Journal for libel or slander. Is there anything equivalent to that now?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Danny will tell you, we have lawyers because people don't like to get sued, but we have lawyers that vet any kind of investigative stories that we do. They're always vetted by lawyers in New York. I mean, and they drive us crazy. I mean, even to the point of overkill. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah. Try doing a story of Scientology.
Right. So, yes, the fact is, it's a...
In every newsroom, there's you know,
Yeah.
reporter comes in with the story, and a producer that's in charge of the show is going to double check with that, but then there's a producer over the producer, so there's several layers before anything goes out on whether it's a network or a local or even like on the radio news program. They did fact check. Now that doesn't mean that despite the fact that 3 different people have looked at it, something obscure was missed, and then it's going to come in after the fact. And most good, legitimate journalists will quickly correct that. So, and not be sly or snide about the correction. You need to be upfront. We reported last night that was wrong. Here's what's right. So,
Right.
Fact checking is probably at the core of what happens in most newsrooms.
By the way, you can be factually correct and still be biased.
And still be sued.
You can be
Yeah.
very, very biased.
I think I'm going to end on this wonderful note
Okay.
because we can join you and pick your brain even more.
Perfect.
Thank you so much for
It's a
passing.
pleasure. Thank you.